Alright, so we're going to start doing our patterns today. And I have another big sheet of white paper. We're going to divide it into 4 sections. Just similar to what we did before, where I'm going to fold it in half. And then I'm going to cut it in half. It doesn't have to be perfect. Then I'm going to cut each of these pieces of paper in half again. I'm going to put these others to the side because I'm going to need all 4 pieces. And remember, yours will be a bit differently shaped than mine.
For the texture rubbings, find some things around your house that are flat and have a texture that you can feel. I am testing out a few different textures in my sketchbook first, so I know if they will work. I am using the side of a colored pencil, but you can also use crayons for this. You'll get a different effect for each. You can experiment with both different types if you want. I also found items like leaves from my outside area, and you can use those in different ways as well. I actually made a second pattern later with the one leaf. I just moved the leaf around my paper over and over again and kept adding another rubbing to a different part of my paper. I found this bumpy filing container, and this is actually the item that I decided to use for my final paper. I thought the texture was something that I could see really well, and I could use a couple different colors with it too.
Experiment in your sketchbook first before moving on to your actual paper, so you know you have a good texture. Now, since I'm going to use the same texture, what I might do is change the color. I want to make sure I get the whole thing. So my camera cut out while I was finishing up. You can see I changed the color halfway through to orange, and then I actually turned my texture sideways because I didn't think it looked that interesting, and I colored 2 colors. So I put the orange on top of the red over here, and I added a little red on top of the orange here, so it looked a little more interesting. When you're finished with this, put it to the side. Keep it safe for our next live art class. Now for our last paper, you're going to use a wax or oil resist, and we're going to paint on top of our pattern. So I'm using oil pastels, but you can use crayons from your art kit if you don't have oil pastels. Both of those things work just fine. You just need to make sure that your lines are very thick and clear. Going back to my patterns, I think I'm going to do the one that I planned up here with the circles, and I picked out 2 colors for that. With crayons, you're going to need to do more than just one line. Same thing with oil pastels. I'm doing a couple just so it's very thick, so when I paint on top of it, my line won't disappear. Right, now that my design has been drawn completely, I can start to paint. So you'll be getting out your watercolor kit. If you've painted with me in class before, you know I always think it's a good idea to have a paper towel handy for any spills, if you put too much watercolor down, and also to help clean your brush to keep your palette clean. Now my palette looks a little different from yours because I'm using mine, but it all works the same. You add water to the tray in the color that you want, and I'm going to use my brush to move it. So I'll be dipping my brush in here in the water, and dropping it in the color that I want to use a couple times. And then I'm going to just brush the surface. And the more I rub it, the darker it's going to get. So I rub it about 30 seconds. Mine probably don't need that much because they're still soft. But if you haven't used your palette yet, you might need to mix a little bit more. And then you start to paint. And you paint right on top of your design. And you should see that even though I'm painting on top of my oil pastel or crayon, it should pop up. If you want your color to be lighter in some areas, what I do is I tap my brush in the water real quick and pull the color down. So it almost looks like it's fading. Another thing you can do is just add more water to your palette. But I already have a lot of paint on here, so I'm just adding it to my paper right now. You don't have to stick with the same color. If you're going to change, make sure to brush the bottom of your water cup to get the paint off. And then don't forget to scrape. Although since we're using watercolor, you don't really need to scrape that much. So I think I'm going to blend this color with a different red. I'm going to move my paper sideways. Remember not to go too far down the color wheel unless you want to create a brown. So from pink to red, since they're pretty close on the color wheel, you should be safe. They'll blend nicely if they're close to the color, close to each other on the color wheel. Yeah, looks good. All right, and then once you're done, don't forget to clean your brush really well, brushing along the bottom, scraping off the water, using your paper towel. Make sure there's no paint. My brush is clean. It's ready to be used again. Make sure your palette stays open to dry and that you leave your paper that's wet somewhere safe to dry as well before you put it in the pile with your other pattern papers.